Gosh, hello, Evie. Thanks so much for coming to visit the studio space with me. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Hey, Kat. I'm super excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I guess maybe to start, we can just talk about like the things you're excited to talk about, and then we'll jump into the Pussy Gallery and start a conversation.
Yeah. Should we chat a little bit out here first?
Yeah, I think so. We're gathered right now in the conversation pit that I've built. It's meant to replicate the 70s style of the conversation pit at the University of Regina. And it's a place for us to just kind of socially gather and have some conversation together.
Cool. So I really want to ask you something. There was like a really great article in the Carleton recently about this project. And one of the things that you said was that this isn't a story or this isn't an exhibition about the body. And yet looking past you, there's like a giant replica of your surgically constructed vulva. And so I'm wondering if you can talk, just before we go in, if you can talk about the role of satire in this project.
Yeah, I would love to. I think satire is a really powerful tool. And I think the giant pussy that I've constructed is this really, in a way, this satirical construction. And a big part of that is because, let's come look at it. It's ridiculous. It's got, if you look up, there's like a polka dot clitoris, which is made out of mushroom blocks in Minecraft. And awesome. And it's got this like bright magenta labia that just like really, really pops and stands out. And I think I mentioned this during the last stream, but the notion that this like replicates my surgically constructed genitals is kind of like, it's satire, it's funny. This in no way resembles my genitals. My genitals are not constructed out of like 4x4 blocks. And like a surgically constructed pussy does not look like this because it's like part of your body and it's smooth and it's contoured and it's not this like blocky construction. And this is also the vulva through which you enter, and the vaginal cavity that the gallery is in are really the only explicit mentions of the body or the trans body that exists in the exhibit right now. And so it's like you have to go through this narrative of the body to get to the really interesting part, but it's ultimately not about the body.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, I think we've chatted about this a little bit before, but sometimes there's an obsession with trans bodies. And I think part of the satire is like, okay, you want to know about my body? Well, okay, here's this giant pussy that I've constructed. Come on in. Is that kind of what it's like?
Yeah, that is kind of what it's like. I think it's like even my proposal for this project was very provocative in the sense that like I would like to suggest that cisgender people are rather obsessed with trans people's genitals. And we can read this through the frequent question in media that has historically existed, and the question that exists in a lot of trans people's lives of like, have you had like the surgery, where like the and surgery are capitalized. And so it's like, it's a platform to get people interested in trans narratives. But I think if we stop at the body and if we don't challenge the body as the only narrative that exists for transness, then there's like a big problem there.
For sure. It seems to be nighttime again. Should we head on in?
Sure. So if you'll follow me, I've built a little bridge to make it nice and easy to get across to the vulva now.
I mean, I'm not sure, but I'll try and do this in the dark.
Yeah, the audience sees a really nicely lit bridge. I'm also kind of fumbling.
They do. I'm like really new to Minecraft, so it's going to take me a lot slower to get up there than Kat. Oh, oops.
Did you make it? Oh, you're
I
making
made
it. You're doing so good.
I'm here. What's this, Kat?
All right. So if you want to come in, I guess we'll start with this piece again. This is where we started last time, and we're going to start here again. So maybe I'll start with reading this piece, and then you can respond to it, Evie.
Sure.
Okay, here we go. I wanted to be a lesbian before I knew I could be a woman. How do you survive in such a non-space with what feels like and is an abject sexuality? Lisa, the male-identified lesbian, comes to mind, and the role of that joke in the L word in lesbian community. Can one be a lesbian without being a woman? Our community's beautiful and transgressive butches who reject womanhood tell us this is possible. Shouldn't I have access to this same transgression? Can I write myself a lesbian history in the same way I can rewrite a trans history? What does it mean to recontextualize a past? The first lesbian wedding I attended was my own. I just didn't realize it at the time. It wasn't until many years later, talking in bed at 2 a.m. with my wife about transition and life and living and changing, and we realized we're wives. And so we kissed our first kiss as wife and wife. And this is this beautiful picture from my wedding.
Yeah, that's really lovely. And what I want to ask you is, can you elaborate a little bit on, because what I find interesting about it is that you identified as a lesbian even before you identified as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come about?
Yeah, this is going to be a really embarrassing thing to talk about because we really stigmatize porn consumption. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my relationship to lesbian porn coming to age as an adult. I think, I guess I know that through largely porn and through also media narratives, long before I identified or understood the possibility of me existing as a woman, I had a strong desire to exist within the structure of what I perceived as lesbian relationships. Granted, that perception was largely filtered through like a heterosexual and cisgender gaze of lesbian relationships, which is constructed in porn and media. But there was something about, I don't know, the softness, the reciprocation, the tenderness that was displayed in these relationships that really, really spoke to me. And it was a form of relationship that I really desired. And reflecting and talking with my wife about this, it was a form of relationship that we really embodied and lived as well. And it's really funny to reflect on our early or any part of our relationship, because even before I identified as trans or as a woman or as a lesbian, we really existed within a relationship that spoke to a lot of lesbian ideals. And I would suggest that, like, the way we were intimate, the way we shared intimacy, the way we had sex was all very lesbian in nature, even if it wasn't named. It was the way we experienced our relationship. And reflecting on it now, I can read a lot of lesbian culture and intent behind a lot of our relationship. But at the time, it was just our relationship, and it was a seemingly straight relationship, but it was one that, through the way we desired each other and enacted our desire, was in fact very lesbian.
Right. And so, you know, the L Word, there was this character, was Lisa, the lesbian identified man.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, have you actually seen the episode? I haven't seen it, but I've seen clips from it.
Yeah, there's about 2 or 3 episodes that have Lisa in it.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, like, so did that, like, what do you make of that character, and like, how do you read that? And did you identify at all with that?
Oh, do I identify?
Not currently, but like looking back, like at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. Do I or have I identified with Lisa, the male identified lesbian? I'm not sure. You know, there's so much I want to say about this character. I guess to start, I think, you know, it's interesting that Lisa is really kind of like poo-pooed and made fun of by the other lesbians in the show, that he is not dating, but that I forget which character it is, and my friend Jack will be so disappointed, that Lisa is dating.
It's Alice. I went and watched the clip. Yeah.
Okay. And so Alice has this, like, pretty positive and accepting relationship with Lisa, and it's fraught with some problems. But generally, Alice is, like, accepting of this notion that it's possible that Lisa is a lesbian. And so in some ways, I'm retrospectively sad or envious that we can imagine the possibility of that position existing, but that it was not a position I ever had access to. Personally, it wasn't until I started identifying as a woman and as trans that I felt comfortable identifying as a lesbian, truly and wholly, as part of my identity, instead of as just sort of an ideal that I desire.
Yeah,
at the same time, go ahead.
I wonder if there's room for that. I mean, because if you think about, I think we can interrogate what is necessary to be considered a lesbian, and like, it's certainly not, you don't need a pussy to be a lesbian, and you don't even need to identify as a woman. I don't think you could be non-binary and identify as a lesbian. And so is there room to expand criteria for lesbian to man?
Yeah, I want to talk about the paper that you found and shared with me, which is from 1992 and about male identified lesbians or male lesbians.
Published in Hypatia.
And published in Hypatia, which is like a somewhat notable feminist journal. So I'm just gonna read a bit of this because I think it's so interesting. I think it's so powerful. And part of what it talks about, and I think part of what it takes seriously, is this challenge that quote unquote male lesbians exist. And it takes that as a starting point. And it says, as specific strategies designed to match self-intending sex attribution with other extending attributions can be marshaled in the following ways.
Sorry, Kat, I think we dropped the streamed, or Discord might have dropped your audio, I think, for a second. So the stream, just as you were starting to read from the article, the audience heard.
No problem. I'll restart. So, specific strategies designed to match self-intending sex attribution, which would be the male-identified lesbian, or the lesbian who we don't read as a woman, with other extending attributions, can be marshaled in the following ways. And they suggest 4 interventions. And I'm going to preface this by reminding the audience this was written in 1992. And so some of the language is not perfect. We've moved beyond it, but these figurations are still useful, I think. So 1, change the physical structure of the body to fit the genital morphological category of female. Ask that others overlook the man-made reconstructions of these genitalia and the chromosomal traces left unaltered in your body, which is to say, a post-operative transsexual strategy. Option 2, valorize the feeling of inner certainty of being a woman trapped in a male body. This is a problematic narrative, but this is 1992. Ask that others look beyond the somatic form of your body and look for signs of this, quote, inner figuration of your body's sex or its reconstitution in deep gender identity. This is a, quote, transgendering strategy. 3, request a reading of your body that decenters genital and gonadal anatomy as the essential criterion of sex identity. Ask that others, quote, overlook these indicators in attributing sex identity to you. And they describe this as a genital de-essentializing strategy. Or 4, and perhaps most provocatively, engage in, quote, gender fuck, taking seriously the centrality of meaning in sex acts as sufficient criterion for sex category membership, and construct sex scenes in which your sex acts take on meaning of acts performed by the, quote, opposite sex. Ask that others agree to these readings in this criterion for sex category membership, i.e. a special gender fuck strategy. So these are all of these opportunities to rewrite what it means to be a lesbian. And they go from very bodily, from like surgical intervention, to very social in the notion of gender fuck and accepting the notion of gender fuck within lesbian community.
Yeah, and I think we should take up this idea of gender fuck, because in the L Word, there's a scene where Alice and Lisa, the lesbian identified man, are having sex or going to have sex. I'm not sure. But I think what happens is that Lisa reaches for a strap-on or wants to have sex with Alice using a strap-on. And Alice is like, no, what are you doing? Like, you have the real, in quotations, the real thing. Like, why would you be doing this? And if we think about like this notion of gender fuck, it's kind of like reconceptualizing body, like material, resignifying like materiality, like the body, parts of the body that you're both in agreement with, and you've had this conversation of like how you're going to interact with each other's bodies.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if we go back to that definition of gender fuck from 1992, it says, taking seriously the centrality of meaning in sex acts as sufficient criterion for sex category membership.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about the way that Lisa is interested in this distinctly, quote unquote, distinctly lesbian way of having sex, which is with a strap on. And she's not interested in having sex with her biological dick because that, to him, doesn't feel like lesbian sex.
Yeah. And I wonder, so like you've shared something really personal. I'm going to share something personal too, because I wonder if, Lisa even thinks of, his cock as a cock, or if he thinks of it as maybe like a clit. And I know, like for me, I have this vision of doing a photo shoot. I have these socks that my partner bought me from Paper Umbrella, which is like a local store here, and they say the words "hung" on them. And I want to do a photo shoot like wearing the socks, but not wearing a strap on, like not wearing a dildo. And because I have a cock, like in my imagination, and even in my partner's imagination, I have a cock. It has a clit and it has labia, but it's a cock in our shared imagination. And so how can we, I just think it's like, can we expand our notions of, the meanings of various body parts that have such fixed meanings? Yeah,
I love that. I would almost go a step further and suggest that it's not in your imagination that you have a cock. And I would draw on Gail Salamon's notion of body image. And her notion of body image says that our body image isn't fixed. It doesn't relate to our morphological body. It can either extend beyond it or otherwise not match the contours of it. And it is the body that we experience and feel.
And even that article that I sent today, I think there's some reference to sex acts being affirming as well. And like, what would it look like if everyone engaged with their sex partners by having those conversations, like instead of assuming that your body part, that you want me to engage with your body part in this way, and what if we had conversations like, what language do you want me to use, and how do you conceive of your body?
Can I bring you to another piece that I think is really useful right now that I want to share?
Yeah, for sure.
Let's do it. Let's come down here to Psychopathia Transsexualis, 1882/2016. I haven't created a picture for this yet, but I'd like to talk about this piece a bit because I think it really relates to what we're talking about. This is a piece of writing based on a sexological text, arguably the founding sexological text, that was written by Dr. Kraft Ebing, originally published in 1882, I believe. And it was a collection of medical and psychological case histories of patients who had various deviations in their sexuality. And this is one of the first Western texts to really, it's not the first, but it's one of the first and one of the most categorical attempts to classify all forms of sexuality. And within this, Kraft Ebing talks a lot about homosexuality and transgender people through the notion of what he calls sexual inversion, which is sort of this spectrum that ranges on one side as like queer or gay desire or homosexual desire, and on the other side, transgender people. and he classifies transgender people through varying degrees as well. And so this is this piece, this writing piece, which I guess I'll read as well, is largely based on a case history from degree 3 of sexual inversion, degree of transition to change of sex delusion. And what's so interesting about it is that it's an autobiographical case history written by a physician that we would likely now describe as a trans woman, but that language didn't exist at the time. And I'm going to read you this story. And the reason this story is included in my exhibit is because we talked about the importance of trans histories. And this is this really great example of how I found myself in history. And it's a story about a trans person who who smoked too much weed and then turned into a woman. So here we go. She says, at one point in my life, I took to baths to manage my gout. And I changed this to anxiety in the text because I took to baths to manage my anxiety. She says, on one of these occasions, it happened that I suddenly changed. I sprang with all my remaining strength out of the bath. I had felt exactly like a woman with libido. This happened when the extract of Indian hemp came into vogue and was highly prized. In a state of fear of a threatened attack of gout and feeling perfectly indifferent about life, I took 3 or 4 times the usual dose of it and almost died of hashish poisoning. Convulsive laughter, a feeling of unheard of strength and swiftness, a peculiar feeling in my brain and eyes, millions of sparks streaming from the brain through the skin. All of these feelings occurred, but I could not force myself to speak. All at once, I saw myself a woman from my toes to my breast. And who could describe my fright when, on the next morning, I awoke and found myself feeling as if completely changed into a woman. General feeling. I feel like a woman, and though I am often sensible of the man's form, it is always in the feminine sense. Thus I feel the penis as clitoris, the scrotum as labia majora, and the skin all over my body feels feminine. Since then, all of my sensory impressions are as if they were feminine in form and relation. The cerebral system almost immediately adjusted so that all my ailments were manifested in a feminine way. I'll stop there. I think it's so interesting that this is decades before the first gender-affirming genital surgery. And despite this author talks about the distinct feeling of their genitals feeling transformed into a distinctly separate sensation, which to me really matches up with like what you just talked about and described. And so I love that there's this like centuries old history of this feeling.
Yeah, and it's like not a narrative that's told really.
Yeah, we always talk about transsexualism, and I use that word very, very specifically, as a very modern phenomenon because of the medical advances that have made it possible. But if we're talking about cross or different gender identity or different sex identity and feeling, we can read that history. We can read that history everywhere, even within Western medical science, which is, you know, one of the frameworks that has really worked to squash it.
How do you think of your audience for this?
Oh, geez. As layers. I think it was my partner Jay who once described audience as like an onion. with multiple layers. And you can kind of peel them back, and it's the same onion, but there's different layers of meaning. I might be just brutalizing what she said. Sorry, Jay. But I think this idea is really powerful. And so I am really writing to and creating this exhibit for other trans people, to make space for these narratives, to make space for these ideas, to challenge a lot of these ideas and what they're about, and to create distinctly different narratives than currently exist. And I hope, I hope a trans person, I hope a trans woman will come look at my wedding picture and be like, holy fuck, me too. Like that would be the best experience I could imagine, as part of this exhibit, to be like, wow, I see myself in this exhibit, and it's not a history or a sense of self that I've necessarily maybe been allowed to feel because of how constraining trans narratives can be. And so this is really an exhibit about expansive transness for trans people. I think there is a lot for the non-trans audience to take from this. I think it takes a bit more work to really sit with the pieces and to think about them, and they'll be experienced in a very different way. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for knowledge and growth in this about what transness looks like and is about, and also isn't about.
And so that maybe the cisgender audience is like another layer. It's a secondary layer.
Yeah, it's a secondary layer, and I'm going to be real with you, Evie. It's not a layer I'm particularly concerned about. I think cisgender audience members will take what they take from it. And I think there's a lot of offerings and a lot to learn here. But really, I'm writing for other trans people and trans women and femmes, and yeah. Well,
I think we're going to be on a panel this weekend and talking a little bit about trans T for T artwork, trans for trans. And I'm just thinking a little bit about Gail Keegan's theory of trans points of reception. I think this is relevant. I want to talk about it now because Gail Keegan's a scholar, and he's a trans man, and one of his articles theorizes it's a trans phenomenology in relation to media. So he's thinking about how he consumes media. And in this article, he says, I'm surrounded by media about trans people. Like, it's on the rise. Like, there's a lot more media images of trans people, and yet he yearns for other kinds of representation. and the reason he says that is because he's making the argument that a lot of media about trans people is intended for a cisgender audience. And when you center a cisgender audience, you run the risk of the narrative being singular or neat and tidy, and alienating trans people from consuming this when they consume this. So what he does is he theorizes, well, because of this, I'm going to turn to popular media images that aren't intended for a trans audience and try and read them through a trans lens, or try and receive them. He refers to it as a trans points of reception. And so he goes back to the 90s when he was younger, and he thinks about this ad for milk. It's a commercial. You might remember milk does a body good. And he thinks about how in this ad, this boy drinks milk and then looks in the mirror. He's this big muscular man. And that image resonated with him more so than some of the media that he's consumed about trans people. It resonated with what he calls his trans affect.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's like, it's risky to, I mean, I think it can be important if you're trying to educate cisgender audience, but then you run into like overgeneralizing about trans people, and it can be risky. I think like the most transformative artwork that I've experienced is trans for trans artwork. And so I know though that you seem to like French feminist theory, which isn't intended for a trans audience. And so I wonder if like this theory of like trans points of reception applies to your readings or how you're engaging with second wave feminist theory or French feminist theory.
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of my work with French feminist theory is based on I'm not an expert on auto theory, but I would like to suggest that it's an auto-theoretical intervention into that cis-sexist feminist theory using my body and my experiences to bring about change.
Since we're in front of a piece that's titled Theory, did you want to read this one?
Will this be useful to the conversation? I'm sure it will. So yeah, let's do it. Let's see what this piece is about.
Okay.
So it starts, there's a joke amongst trans girls that you need a master's degree in gender studies just to understand yourself and justify your existence in some spaces. Is it a joke though? I came to my gender through Judith Butler and her theories of performativity. It's a classic starting point, gender trouble, yet despite now being 30 years old, it's still seminal and central to queer theories of gender. I read and reread gender trouble like the Bible, trying desperately to understand and translate the archaic and academic language that is said to have made the text useful and powerful in the way Judith Butler needed it to be. I traced and followed the genealogy of knowledge like the hips of a tender lover. Slowly and carefully, my fingers trace the words on the page, trying to grasp their intent, trying to touch and feel every inch of the theory. I fall in and out of love with theory, with theorists. How can it be otherwise when we work with something as intimate as words and ideas? Words and ideas are experienced, are lived and loved, and exist within our embodied reality. To work with a theory is to work with love. To work with a theorist is to enter into an intimate partnership with their words and their work and their worlds. We can transform theory through our body and embodied experiences, though it can take work, and we can allow theory to transform our body and embodied experiences. Judith Butler taught me that I am the sum of an ever-living equation that is forever changing. My gender is not a performance, as so many people so often misinterpret Butler's words, but a repetition of a repetition that I can shape and change at will.
It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
Would you say, I have a couple of questions. Would you say that you, would you say, because you mentioned that being in love with theory and various theorists and various theories, what's your relationship to French feminist theory?
Oh, I love it so much. A lot of French feminist theory and a lot of the French feminist theory that I've worked with has specifically looked at the ethics and problematics of sexual difference. And we don't have time to get into theories of sexual difference in this talk, unfortunately, though I would love to. But I think, French feminist theory it has a really good intent, and it is trying really hard to understand this really complex problem. And it fucks up and it falls short, and theorists make mistakes. But I think Lucy Eyre Gray, in particular, I want to talk about, who wrote An Ethics of Sexual Difference, and that book is what a lot of my master's thesis is about. I love that book. I have spent so many hours reading and rereading it and dissecting it. And I think it's impossible to work with a text that closely and not fall in love with it. Even if you hate it or hate parts of it, you can't help but feel a sense of attachment to it because of how deeply you've worked with it. But I also think within French feminist texts and within theories of sexual difference, if we move beyond the body into embodied experiences, and I think there's an important parallel between the two that is often ignored. Sexual difference becomes this really incredibly powerful framework for talking about relationality between people and between different versions of the self that can exist at different points in time and space.
Mm-hmm. Are you talking about sexual difference even within the self?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm excited to maybe dig into in our panel on Saturday, and maybe we can link the information to it in the chat, or Ender Gallery can otherwise share it, is how we can take up autogynephilia in a fun way. So autogynephilia is this really kind of problematic sexological theory that is said to describe trans women, and it's about the way it describes trans women as men who sexually desire reflections of themselves as women. But I think it provides this really playful opportunity to say that sexual difference can exist within ourselves. And I think transness in general says that at different points in time, at different points in space, we can exist as differently sexed or gendered bodies and people and subjects. And so it's really interesting to think about difference existing within the self. And that's something that I can really relate to in terms of I don't know, I'm going to get really provocative here. We often talk about transness through the narrative of born that way. And this notion that to be trans, you have to have been trans from a very young age. And there is this impulse to rewrite your history towards a trans history where everything explains why you're trans now. But if I'm being brutally honest, I didn't identify as trans or a woman until I was 26 or 27 and met a trans person, and that possibility opened up for me. There are certainly trans moments that I can identify before that really speak to an incongruence between my assumed gender or sex and my gender. But I wouldn't say I was trans until that opportunity was opened up. And I would even go so far as to say, like, being trans and being a woman was an active choice. And I think there's a lot of power and agency in that. And I think we often are scared about talking about that because in order to get rights, we feel we need to show that we're exactly like cisgender and heterosexual people, but just naturally or biologically different. And so to challenge that with the notion of that my womanhood is very conscious and intentional is a really important provocation, I think, within like notions of what it means to be trans.
Yeah, and I think sometimes this constructed narrative that's presented to us through the media might even compel us to go back and look at our lives and fit it into that narrative.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think we were going to take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, maybe we can go back to the conversation pit and open it up to the audience.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, let's do it.
I've been hiding out like the meat of the camera. Here I am.
Evie can't fly, so they need to like struggle across the bridge.
I'm like, how did you go so fast? Okay,
Cheat codes.
Yay. Are there any questions from the audience?
Not currently, but Pat, I was really interested in what you were speaking about earlier about the body image and that the experience and feel of the body extends the conception of the body, and then also in relationship to what you've been posting about on Instagram, specifically some of the questions towards reskinning blocks and to like apply skin to a block and to perhaps the body extends into the blocks as you are doing so with taking images of your own body and actually placing them on blocks as textures. I was just sort of curious about because you're mentioning the thought process that's gone into maybe talk about some of those thoughts you've been having about what it means to rename flesh. As I loved as you that sentence you wrote. Yeah, and to skin a block, to place, to kind of I guess transform these blocks in again kind of a comical or satirical flesh, but nonetheless something that you are choosing to represent as parts of the body with.
Yeah, it's so I'm gonna draw on my history as a trans educator here. If you look at the way that embryonic genitals develop, like the clit and the glands of the penis are ultimately the same. And the scrotum and like labia majora are ultimately the same. They develop from the same tissue, and they develop in what we perceive as a very binary, but what in reality is actually a very spectral way. And so renaming flesh within this particular context, I think is really interesting, but we can do it outside of this context too. But I think about what Evie talked about in terms of having a cock. And I can talk to a similar experience of like prior to surgery experiencing like the glands of my penis as a clit and intentionally experiencing it that way, reshifting and reframing it to experience it that way, both through language and self-perception and asks of other people about how they perceive that as well. And so I think a lot of times when we talk about transition in relation to transness, we're talking about a very medical transition. But I think about the like deep power of something as simple, and I say simple maybe playfully here because it's not simple to rename flesh. In practice, like the difference between like naming the tip of your penis a glans or a clit is very, very easy to conceptually change that language. But one of the things that Gail Salomon says about body image is that body image remains in place and in play and is actually more difficult to change than our physical body itself. It is harder to reconceptualize a body part as something new than it is to just change that body part. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, that is. I haven't read Gail Sullivan. Yeah, that's super fascinating. I was thinking of as well, you mentioned earlier, like being interested in auto theory and like your project is heavily, I would call it heavily auto theoretical. And I was also thinking like the extension of auto theory into like I'm specifically interested in how role play, how auto theory comes in role play, but also I think the world building is part of that. And I think here you have you're creating a world that is entirely based upon your own experience or in the world, your own narrative as well as the narratives that perhaps others may have experienced. Are there any auto theorists that you draw upon, or how has that genre, I guess, influenced your approach to it?
Yeah, I think I draw really heavily on Lorraine Fournier's Auto Theory in Contemporary Art book, which I'm working through right now. It's absolutely lovely, and I highly recommend it. And I think one of the things that she does that's really powerful is that she links this notion of auto theory as extending sort of beyond this very, very recent of when auto theory was named, and looks at histories of Black feminist thought, and like other various feminist authors who have incorporated the body into their work and who have insisted on the importance of experience in feminist theory and theorizing, that we cannot theorize apart from the body or the experience.
That's lovely. We have we do have a question. We have a comment. I'll read the comment and then the question in this order. From Aspen, we see a comment saying, "It's super funny to me that the clit is made out of mushrooms. Another little bit of the playfulness of this installation." And then a question from John. Is there a distinction between trans as a choice and the tendency for gender identity to shift over time?
Well, that's a good question, I guess. I think, I mean, I think, 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 So I can only speak to my own relationship to gender. And for me, both of those things have been true. I think gender can and does shift over time. It's socially constructed, it's performatively constructed, which is to say it's always a copy of a copy. And so it's in this constant state of flux and change. In terms of transness as a choice versus transness as or gender diversity as something fluid, I think those two things can exist in tandem. I think there are people who, like me, experience gender as something that was chosen, but I really, really want to emphasize that just because I made a deliberate, conscious choice to be a woman, it doesn't make my womanhood any less real or valid. It is still something that I experience in the same specific, real way than like a trans woman who has felt like a woman from birth. Or from a very, very young age. Obviously, those experiences aren't identical, but I would argue that the legitimacy of both of those identities are as valid. And so I think it's important that we allow for opportunities for gender to be something that is understood naturally as coming from within us, because that's the experience for a lot of people. And for a lot of people, that's their reality. And for a lot of people, it's something that they approach with intentionality and deliberation. And I think it's important that we don't create a hierarchy in particular between those two experiences.
Thank you so much, Kat. And thank you for this conversation. I just wanted to ask again about the event that the two are both involved in on Saturday for the audience. For details about that, I was trying to find the link.
Sure, we can pass it along after, but it's a panel in partnership between Commonweal Community Arts and the University of Saskatchewan Art Gallery. And it's a panel involving Evie, myself, and another trans individual and advocate, Jack Brasser. And the title of the panel is Queering Scopophilia, and it's going to be all about the cisgender gaze, how to counter it, and how to work empathetically and compassionately with trans audiences.
And like trans people in your art.
And trans people in your art, yes.
Working with them. Yeah.
And it requires, I'm just seeing now, it requires registration to attend the panel. And you can email hello@conceives.ca. Oh, and the link also in the Twitch chat.
Great.
That we are reposting in Facebook.
Thanks for sharing that.
And then, is there anything the two of you would like to share before we close tonight? Evie, where can folks find you or your work online?
I don't have a website, so but yeah, you could follow me on Twitter. I think it's Evie Johnny at Evie Johnny. Before we go, could you show me the skating rink you built?
Oh my God, do we have like 2 minutes?
Absolutely.
So Evie had a dream about a skating rink in the summertime.
Yeah, so it was my first time using Minecraft just last week, and the first question they asked when you open Minecraft is like, what do you want to name the world that you're going to create? And I just sat there for 5 minutes and then closed my computer because the possibilities were endless, and I'm not used to having endless possibilities for world making. And so then that night I had a dream that I built a skating rink in the summertime in Minecraft, and then Kat made my dream come true.
So this is Ruddy Rank, and if you float up high and look down on it, you may notice that it is actually a regulation size hockey rink.
Oh my god!
With proper dimensions, which is really funny because I'm not really a hockey fan. And I thought a lot about my brother while I was making this, who is a hockey fan.
It's beautiful. I love it.
And so maybe someday we can do like a joint figure skating performance.
Ooh, how did you do that? Twirl in the air. Well, thanks, Kat.
Yes, thank you so much, Kat, and thank you, Evie. And
Thank
we'll
you.
remind the audience that the opening of the exhibition will be on server, and you can actually skate on this skating rink here, as well as see all of the art that the wonderful art that we've been discussing this evening on May 8th. So that is Saturday, May 8th at 12 noon Saskatchewan time. And the details on how to log on to the server will be released closer to the event. So stay tuned.
Hooray!
Yes, thank you, everyone. See you all then.